I do understand why they're sending away the children from the cities. The Germans won't bomb the countryside, will they? But if you let your children go away without you, you never stop worrying. And if you go with them, it's hard on the husbands left at home. Ah, yes, and it becomes expensive running two homes. This place seems quite a reasonable price, said Tuppence. Yes, I'd say you get good value. Mrs. Perenna's a strange woman, though. There's been a great drama in that woman's life. I'm certain of that. Do you really think so? I do. And the mystery she makes of herself. And where do you come from in Ireland? I asked her. And would you believe it? She said she was not from Ireland at all. You think she is Irish? Of course she's Irish. I know my own countrywomen. I could name you the county she comes from. But there, I'm English, she says, and my husband was a Spaniard. Mrs. O'Rourke stopped speaking as Mrs. Sproat came in, followed by Tommy. Tuppence immediately took on a playful manner. Good evening, Mr. Meadows. You look very well this evening. Plenty of exercise, that's the secret, Tommy replied. Then the rest of the party came in, and the conversation during the meal was about spies. Only Sheila Perenna took no part in the conversation. She sat there, her dark face angry. Carl von Dynam was out, so everyone was speaking freely. Sheila only spoke once. Mrs. Sproat said in her thin voice, "The biggest mistake I think the Germans made in the last war was to shoot Nurse Cavell. It turned everybody against them." It was then that Sheila demanded, "Why shouldn't they shoot her? She was an English spy, wasn't she? She helped English people to escape in an enemy country. Why shouldn't she be shot?" "Oh, but shooting a woman and a nurse." Sheila got up. "I think the Germans were quite right," she muttered. She went out of the glass door into the garden. Everyone then went into the lounge for coffee. Only Tommy went out to the garden. He found Sheila Perenna standing by the garden wall, staring out at the sea. He offered her a cigarette, which she accepted. "Lovely night," he commented. In a low voice, the girl answered, "It could be." "If it weren't for the war, you mean?" he asked quietly. "I don't mean that at all. I hate the war." "So do we all." "Not in the way I mean. I hate the horrible, horrible patriotism." "Patriotism?" Tommy was surprised. "Yes, I hate patriotism. Betraying your country, dying for your country, serving your country. Why should one's country mean anything at all?" Tommy said simply, "I don't know. It just does." "Not to me. Oh, it would to you. You believe in the British Empire and the stupidity of dying for one's country." "My country," said Tommy, "won't let me die for it." "Yes, but you want to. And it's so stupid. Nothing's worth dying for. It's all an idea. Talk, talk. My country doesn't mean anything to me at all." "Someday," said Tommy, "you'll find that it does." "No, never. I've suffered. I've seen. Do you know who my father was? His name was Patrick Maguire. He was a follower of Casement in the last war. He was shot as a traitor, all for nothing. Why couldn't he just stay at home quietly? He's a martyr to some people and a traitor to others. I think he was just stupid." "So that's the secret you've grown up with?" "Yes. Mother changed her name. We lived in Spain for some years. She always says that my father was half Spanish. We always tell lies wherever we go. We've been all over Europe. Finally, we came here, and I think running this guest house is the worst thing we've done yet. I hate it." "How does your mother feel about things?" Tommy asked. "You mean about my father's death?" Sheila was silent a moment, thinking carefully about the question. She said slowly, "I've never really known. She never talks about it. It's not easy to know what Mother feels or thinks." Tommy nodded his head thoughtfully. I don't know why I've been telling you this," Sheila said abruptly. "I got angry. Where did it all start?" "A discussion on Edith Cavell." "Oh, yes. Patriotism. I said I hated it." "Aren't you forgetting Nurse Cavell's own words?" "What words?" "Before she died. Don't you know what she said?" He repeated the words. "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred in my heart." "Oh." She stood there for a moment. Then, turning quickly, she ran off into the shadow of the garden. Mrs. Blenkinsop stopped at the post office. She bought stamps and went into one of the public phone boxes. There, she rang up a certain number and asked for Mr. Faraday. This was how they contacted Mr. Grant. She came out smiling and walked home, stopping on the way to buy some knitting wool. It was a pleasant afternoon with a light wind. Tuppence changed her normally energetic walk into a slow and easy one, more like the way someone like Mrs. Blenkinsop would walk. Mrs. Blenkinsop had nothing else to do except knit and write letters to her boys. She was always writing letters to her boys, and sometimes she left them lying around, half-finished. Tuppence came slowly up the hill towards Sans-Souci. Since the road ended at Smuggler's Rest, Commander Haydock's house, few people walked there. She noticed a woman standing by the gate looking inside. It was not until Tuppence was close behind her that the woman heard her and turned. She was a tall woman, poorly dressed. She was not young, probably just under 40, blonde-haired and beautiful. Just for a minute, Tuppence had a feeling that the woman was familiar. A look of fear crossed the woman's face. "Are you looking for someone?" Tuppence said. The woman spoke slowly, with a foreign accent. "This house is Sans-Souci? Can you tell me, please, is there a Mr. Rosenstein staying there?" Tuppence shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not. Perhaps he has been there and left. Will I ask for you?" No, I make mistake. Excuse, please." Then she turned and walked quickly down the hill. Tuppence stood staring after her, feeling suspicious. But following the woman could make people think that Mrs. Blenkinsop was not who she appeared to be. Inside, the house seemed very quiet and empty, which was usual early in the afternoon. Betty was having her sleep. The older residents were either resting or had gone out. Then a sound came to Tuppence's ears. The telephone at Sans-Souci was in the hall. Tuppence heard the sound of someone lifting or replacing a telephone extension. There was only one extension, in Mrs. Perenna's bedroom. Very carefully, Tuppence lifted the telephone receiver in the hall and heard a man's voice. "Everything going well? On the 4th, then, as arranged?" "Yes, carry on," a woman's voice replied. There was a click as the telephone was replaced. Tuppence stood frowning. Was that Mrs. Perenna's voice she had heard? It was difficult to say. There was movement behind her, and Tuppence put down the receiver as Mrs. Perenna spoke. "It is such a pleasant afternoon. Are you going out, Mrs. Blenkinsop, or have you just come in?" So, it was not Mrs. Perenna who had been in Mrs. Perenna's room. Tuppence said something about having had a lovely walk and moved to the staircase. Mrs. Perenna moved along the hall after her. She seemed bigger than usual. Tuppence was conscious of her as a strong, athletic woman. She hurried up the stairs. As she turned the corner of the landing, she collided with Mrs. O'Rourke, whose vast body blocked the top of the stairs. "Dear, dear, Mrs. Blenkinsop, you seem to be in a great hurry." There was, as always, a frightening quality about Mrs. O'Rourke's smile, and suddenly Tuppence felt afraid. The big, smiling Irishwoman, with her deep voice, blocking her way, and below Mrs. Perenna at the foot of the stairs. And then, suddenly, the tension broke as a little figure ran along the top hall. Little Betty Sproat, shouting happily as she threw herself on Tuppence. The atmosphere had changed. Mrs. O'Rourke, a big, friendly figure, cried out, "Oh, the darling!" Below, Mrs. Perenna had turned away to the door that led into the kitchen. And the atmosphere on the stairs, thought Tuppence, that tense moment, might have been just her own overactive nerves. Chapter 5. Commander Haydock welcomed Tommy and Major Bletchley with enthusiasm, and insisted on showing Mr. Meadows all over my little place. Smuggler's Rest had been 2 cottages standing on the cliff overlooking the sea. A London businessman had bought them and made them into one. There was a small cove below, but the path down to it was dangerous. "Then, some years ago," explained Haydock, "Smugglers was sold to a man called Hahn. He was a German, and if you ask me, he was a spy. The Nazis are methodical. They were preparing even then for this war. Look at the situation of this place. It's perfect for sending signals out to sea. And there's a cove below where you could land a small boat without being seen. Oh, yes. Don't tell me that Hahn wasn't a German agent. He spent a lot of money on this place. He had a path made down to the beach, concrete steps, an expensive business. Then he had the whole of the house improved. And who did he get to do all this? Not a local man. No, it was a firm from London, or so they say. But a lot of the men who came down didn't speak a word of English. Don't you agree that that sounds extremely suspicious?" "A little strange, certainly," agreed Tommy. "I was staying in the neighbourhood at the time, and I used to watch the workmen. They didn't like it. Once or twice they were quite threatening. Why should they be if everything was okay? I went to the authorities, and what response did I get? Another war with Germany was impossible, they insisted. There was peace in Europe. Our relations with Germany were excellent. No one believed me when I said that the Germans were building the finest air force in Europe." Haydock's face was redder than usual with anger. "They thought I was just trying to start another war. But finally I began to make an impression. We had a new chief constable down here, a retired soldier, and he listened to me. His men began to investigate, and then Hahn left secretly one night. The police searched this place carefully. In a safe built into a wall in the dining room, they found a wireless transmitter and big tanks under the garage for petrol. The end of the story was that I bought the place when it was put up for sale. Come and have a look round, Meadows." "Thanks, I'd like to." Commander Haydock was as full of energy as a man half his age. He threw open the big safe in the dining room to show where the secret transmitter had been found. Tommy was taken out to the garage and was shown where the big petrol tanks had been hidden. And finally, he was led down the steep path to the little cove and taken into the cave that had given the place its name, because it was where the smugglers had hidden their goods. More than ever now, Tommy felt that when the dying Farquhar had mentioned Sans Souci, he had been on the right track. This part of the coast had been selected for enemy activity. His spirits rose. Although Sans Souci seemed an innocent place, behind the scenes, things were going on. Mrs. Blenkinsop was reading a letter on thin foreign paper stamped outside with a censor's mark. This was the direct result of her conversation with Mr. Faraday. "Dear Raymond," she said, "I was so happy about him being out in Egypt, and now it seems there is a big change round. All very secret, of course, and he can't say anything, just that there really is a marvellous plan, and that I'm to be ready for some big surprise soon. I'm glad to know where he's being sent, but Bletchley frowned. "Surely he's not allowed to tell you that?" Tuppence looked round the breakfast table as she folded up her precious letter. "Oh, we have our methods," she said with a little laugh. "And dear Raymond knows that if I know where he is, or where he's going, I don't worry quite so much. It's quite a simple code, too. Just a certain word, and after it the first letters of the next words spell out the place. I'm sure nobody would notice." Little murmurs arose round the table. The moment was well chosen. Everybody was at the breakfast table together for once. Bletchley, his face red, said, "Mrs. Blenkinsop, that's a very stupid thing to do. It's the movements of soldiers and airmen that are just what the Germans want to know." "Oh, but I never tell anyone," cried Tuppence, "and I'm very careful never to leave letters around. I always keep them locked up." Bletchley shook his head. It was a grey morning, with the wind blowing coldly from the sea. Tuppence was at the far end of the beach. As she reached the bottom of the cliff, her attention was caught by two figures standing talking a little way up. It was the same fair-haired woman she had seen the day before, and Karl von Deinem. At that moment, the young German turned his head and saw her. Immediately, the two figures parted. The woman came quickly down the hill and crossed the road. Karl von Deinem waited until Tuppence came up to him. Then, politely, he wished her good morning. Tuppence inquired immediately, "Was that a friend you were talking to, Mr. Deinem?" "Not at all," said Karl. "She is Polish, and asked me if I knew a Mrs. Gottlieb she thinks lives near here. I do not, and she says she has, perhaps, got the name of the house wrong." "I see," murmured Tuppence thoughtfully. Mr. Rosenstein, Mrs. Gottlieb. She felt a growing suspicion about the Polish woman. That evening, before she went to bed, Tuppence pulled out the long drawer of her dressing table. At one side of it was a small box with a cheap lock. Tuppence put on gloves, unlocked the box, and opened it. A pile of letters lay inside. On the top was the one received that morning from Raymond. Tuppence opened it again and frowned. She had placed an eyelash in the fold of the paper this morning. The eyelash was not there now. Somebody was interested in the movements of the British Armed Forces. Who had read her letters? Tuppence thought about it as she lay in bed the following morning. Her thoughts were interrupted by Betty Sproat, who opened the door and ran in. Betty had taken a great liking to Tuppence.